The observation hung in the air like a particularly pungent cigar smoke, and Whimsy noted with some satisfaction the manner in which it produced a silence of the sort that one might expect to follow the announcement of a second mortgage or an indiscretion at the vicar's garden party. Parsons, the valet, whose face had assumed the color of cold porridge upon the discovery of his employer's demise, now shifted his weight from one foot to the other with the anxiety of a man who sensed that his knowledge was about to be subjected to considerably more rigorous examination than he had previously anticipated. Inspector Cadby, to his credit, attempted to reclaim the initiative by suggesting that buttons go missing all the time. Lord Peter, particularly on evening jackets which are, by their nature, subject to considerable wear and tear. A remark which Whimsy received with the sort of benign smile one reserves for children who have offered an explanation of genuine but misguided innocence. The button in question, Whimsy explained, was not merely absent, but had been removed with such deliberate care that the thread-holes remained unmarred, suggesting not the ordinary attrition of daily wear, but rather the calculated intervention of someone possessed of a needle and a moderate degree of patience. Furthermore, and here Whimsy produced from his waistcoat pocket a small velvet button of deep crimson, no larger than a sixpence and precisely the hue of those that adorned the evening jacket draped across Thorne's chair. He had discovered this particular specimen upon the carpet beneath the desk, positioned with a sort of mathematical exactness that suggested it had been placed there rather than merely dropped. Mrs. Thorne, who had remained silent throughout this exchange with the concentrated attention of a woman listening to the reading of a will, now produced a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at her eyes with a gesture that seemed more automatic than genuinely distressed. She was, Whimsy observed, a woman of perhaps 45 years, with a sort of quiet beauty that comes from excellent bone structure and a lifetime of judicious expenditure upon cosmetics and clothing. Her widow's black became her admirably, and her hands, which were long-fingered and elegant, bore evidence of considerable care. A single strand of pearls constituted her sole ornament. When Whimsy turned his attention toward her and inquired, with elaborate courtesy, whether her late husband had been in the habit of removing buttons from his garments in the privacy of his study, she met his gaze with a steadiness that suggested either remarkable composure or a considerable absence of concern regarding her husband's peculiar demeanor. "My husband," she replied with measured precision, "was subject to certain nervous habits. I attributed them to the anxieties of managing his estate and his various business concerns. I cannot pretend to have made a comprehensive study of all his rituals." The response was, Whimsy reflected, precisely what one might expect from a woman of her station and education, vague enough to admit of multiple interpretations, yet sufficiently specific to suggest that some nervous habit was indeed an established fact of domestic life. It was at this juncture that Bunter, having been summoned from the motor car where he had been engaged in the methodical cleaning of various automotive components, entered with a sort of quiet efficiency that seemed to irritate Inspector Cadby considerably. Bunter carried in his hands a tea service, for Whimsy had observed that nothing loosened the tongues of the English quite so effectively as the prospect of properly brewed tea, and proceeded to distribute cups with the precision of a man distributing sacraments at a particularly formal religious ceremony. As he performed this function, Whimsy inquired, seemingly in passing, whether anyone had noticed the time at which Mr. Thorne had dismissed Parsons on the previous evening, and whether the valet's duties had included the arrangement of the fire or the drawing of the curtains. Parsons, who had been regarding the proceedings with the fixed expression of a man watching his employment prospects collapse like a house constructed of cards, now stammered that he had indeed performed both functions at approximately 9:30, immediately prior to his dismissal. The fire, he had ensured, would burn through the evening in the natural way, and the curtains, heavy velvet affairs that hung with theatrical grandeur, had been drawn with the express purpose of ensuring that no draughts should disturb the room during the night. Here Whimsy paused in the consumption of his tea, which Bunter had prepared with such excellence that it seemed almost a violation of its delicate perfection to actually drink it, and observed that a room sealed against the elements and supplied with a fire of adequate proportions would, one might reasonably suppose, maintain a fairly consistent temperature throughout the night. The relevance of this observation was not immediately apparent to anyone save Whimsy himself, yet Inspector Cadby found himself nonetheless making a small notation in his presumably permanent record of the proceedings. Mrs. Marchant, who had been maintaining a rigid posture throughout the interview, now leaned forward with the intensity of a woman who sensed that something of genuine significance was being discussed beneath the surface pleasantries. Whimsy, observing her attention with the satisfaction of an orchestral conductor who has finally succeeded in producing a passage of genuine harmony, turned his regard once more upon Parsons and inquired, with deceptive casualness, whether the valet possessed any knowledge concerning Mr. Thorne's movements subsequent to his retirement to the study. Had there been, for instance, any sounds from the study, the opening or closing of windows, the movement of furniture, the discharge of firearms during the hours between 9:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning? Parsons shook his head with considerable emphasis, explaining that the walls between the study and the servants' quarters were quite thick, sir, being part of the original construction, and that he had heard nothing whatsoever. Yet even as he spoke, Whimsy noted a minute contraction at the corner of his left eye, a tic of the sort that betrays the presence of a lie more effectively than any amount of stammering or evasion could accomplish. The eye twitch, which Whimsy permitted to pass without comment, proved to be the first genuine crack in the otherwise seamless facade of domestic routine that had been constructed around the circumstances of Charles Augustus Thorne's demise. Inspector Cadby, whose observational faculties had apparently been exercised primarily in the direction of concluding investigations rather than initiating them, remained oblivious to this microscopic betrayal, whilst Mrs. Thorne resumed her ministrations with her handkerchief with a degree of focus that suggested she was attempting to absorb the entire fabric into the delicate cambric through sheer concentration of will. It was Mrs. Marchant, however, whose sudden intake of breath indicated that the significance of Parsons' denial had penetrated her understanding with the force of a particularly well-aimed accusation. Whimsy, rising with the fluid grace of a man whose long limbs had been trained from youth to navigate the precise distances between objects in rooms, suggested that perhaps it would be advisable to examine the study in greater detail, particularly with regard to the windows and their mechanisms of operation. He had observed, during his initial inspection, that the sashes possessed the sort of counterweight system that one frequently encounters in houses of Ravenswood's vintage, and he wondered aloud whether such systems might be subject to certain idiosyncrasies of operation. Perhaps a window that appeared closed yet was in fact merely resting against its frame with insufficient force to constitute a true seal. This observation prompted Cadby to rise as well, though with considerably less grace and considerably more creaking of joints that suggested a man whose relationship with his own physical corpus was one of perpetual negotiation. The small party processed toward the study once more, Whimsy leading with the air of a curator conducting a tour through particularly significant historical remains, whilst Bunter brought up the rear with the sort of unobtrusive attentiveness that made him seem less like a servant and more like an extension of Whimsy's own consciousness. The windows, when subjected to Whimsy's careful examination, proved to be secured from within by means of a simple brass catch, the sort of device that presents no significant impediment to entry or exit if one possesses the requisite knowledge of its operation. More intriguingly, however, the sill of the window nearest to the desk bore evidence of having been recently disturbed. A fine layer of dust had been displaced in a manner consistent with the passage of a hand or an arm, and the wood itself displayed the faintest of scratches where something sharp had encountered the surface. When Whimsy knelt upon the carpet with a sort of unself-conscious disregard for his sartorial perfection that consistently amazed those who knew him, he discovered, wedged behind the radiator that occupied the space beneath the window-sill, a small fragment of what appeared to be dark cloth, no larger than a postage stamp, and of the precise shade one might associate with evening wear. The discovery of this fragment seemed to produce in Inspector Cadby the effect of a man suddenly confronted with the evidence of his own profound intellectual inadequacy. His face, which had begun the morning in a state of comfortable satisfaction regarding the straightforward nature of the suicide, now assumed the color and texture of a beetroot that had been left in the sun for a considerable duration. Whimsy, extracting the fragment with the careful precision of an archaeologist retrieving a pottery shard from an ancient excavation, held it to the light with an expression of serene concentration, and remarked that it bore a striking resemblance to the weave of the evening jacket currently draped across the study chair. This observation, whilst perfectly accurate, seemed to strike Cadby with the force of a personal accusation, and he began to stammer something about examination procedures and proper protocol. Phrases which Whimsy received with the sort of patient sympathy one might extend to a man attempting to explain himself while standing in a puddle of his own making. It was at this precise moment that Bunter, who had been conducting his own examination of the room with the sort of minute attention that suggested he was counting threads in the carpet, cleared his throat with the sort of significance that indicated the presence of additional information of considerable consequence. Upon invitation to speak, Bunter proceeded to direct attention toward the fire, which had by that hour burned considerably lower than it had been upon Whimsy's initial examination. The ashes, Bunter observed, contained fragments that appeared inconsistent with the ordinary byproducts of combustion. Specifically, several charred remnants that bore a striking resemblance to paper that had been exposed to considerable heat. Furthermore, the poker, which lay upon the hearth, displayed evidence of having been employed for purposes beyond the simple arrangement of fuel, exhibiting scratches and marks upon its iron surface that suggested its use as a tool for the manipulation of materials within the fire itself. Whimsy's expression, upon receipt of this intelligence, assumed the quality of a man who had been vindicated in some private suspicion, and he proceeded immediately to undertake a careful examination of the ashpan, extracting therefrom several fragments that, whilst largely destroyed, retained sufficient structural integrity to suggest their origin as pages from a bound volume or perhaps a considerable quantity of correspondence. The significance of these discoveries appeared to dawn upon Mrs. Marchant with considerable force, and she now moved toward Mrs. Thorne with an expression that suggested she possessed several questions that demanded immediate and comprehensive answers. Mrs. Thorne, however, rose with a smoothness that belied any sense of perturbation and declared that she found the proceedings increasingly tedious, and that she intended to retire to her chamber. An announcement which Whimsy received with a slight inclination of his head and the observation that he rather feared that would not prove possible, at least not until certain matters had been clarified to his satisfaction. The statement, delivered with the sort of courteous firmness that one might employ in suggesting that a guest remain for luncheon despite their protestations of prior engagement, produced an immediate alteration in the atmosphere of the study, as though someone had drawn a curtain across a window and revealed not the familiar prospect of the English countryside, but rather something considerably more sinister and unforgiving. Mrs. Thorne remained standing, her elegant posture maintained with a rigidity that suggested the application of considerable will, and her expression assumed the quality of a woman who has suddenly discovered that the floor upon which she stands is not, in fact, solid ground, but rather the thinnest of veneers stretched across a considerable abyss. Inspector Cadby, his earlier satisfaction wholly evaporated and replaced by the dawning awareness that he had been navigating toward a conclusion of such spectacular wrongness that it would likely constitute the primary topic of conversation in the constabulary for several years to come, reached instinctively for a chair and seated himself with the air of a man whose knees had commenced a rebellion against his continued vertical orientation. Whimsy, observing these reactions with the satisfaction of one who has successfully predicted the precise manner in which a house of cards will collapse when subjected to the application of a single strategically positioned breath, proceeded to articulate the chain of reasoning that had led him to this juncture with the sort of methodical clarity that suggested he had been conducting such expositions since childhood. The matter, Whimsy explained, positioned himself at the focal point of the room with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of serene authority, was not one of suicide at all, but rather of murder accomplished through a method of such calculated subtlety that it had been designed precisely to create the impression of self-destruction. The revolver, he continued, had not been held by the deceased at the moment of its discharge, but rather had been placed in his hand subsequent to the fatal bullet's passage through his cranium, a distinction of considerable importance, as it indicated that some person possessed of knowledge of Mr. Thorne's habits and movements had orchestrated his death with the precision of a theatrical production. The velvet button, which had seemed such an insignificant detail to Inspector Cadby, was in fact the linchpin of the entire mechanism, for it had been deliberately removed from the evening jacket and left upon the carpet as a signal, a mark indicating that the murder had been accomplished, that the first phase of an elaborate plan had achieved its intended conclusion. The fragments in the fireplace, charred beyond complete identification, yet sufficiently substantial to suggest their origin as pages from a journal or ledger, represented the destruction of evidence that might have revealed the motive underlying this most exceptional crime. The window, which appeared sealed from within, had in fact been left in a state of carefully contrived apparent closure, whilst remaining sufficiently unsecured to permit passage to one who possessed both the knowledge of its mechanism and the physical agility required to effect such transit without leaving evidence of disturbance. Mrs. Thorne's hands, which had been trembling with increasing violence throughout this recitation, now clenched into fists at her sides, and her face assumed an expression of such concentrated fury that it seemed almost as though a different woman had inhabited her elegant frame, and was now regarding the assembled company with the intensity of a caged predator. When Whimsy proceeded to explain that the murder had been accomplished by a woman who had entered the study through the window approximately 1 hour after Mr. Thorne's dismissal of Parsons, a woman who possessed both intimate knowledge of the household and access to Mr. Thorne's study at all hours without exciting suspicion, Mrs. Thorne's composure underwent a transformation so complete and so absolute that it seemed almost miraculous that the same individual could have maintained such careful control throughout the preceding hours of interrogation and investigation. "You cannot prove this," she said, her voice assuming a quality of icy precision that suggested all pretense of grief or confusion had been abandoned in favor of a frank acknowledgment of the proceedings. "Proof," Whimsy responded with a slight smile, "is precisely what I possess in considerable abundance. The fragments in the fire, when subjected to proper chemical analysis, will undoubtedly prove to be pages from Mr. Thorne's private correspondence. Specifically, his correspondence with a certain gentleman in Birmingham regarding financial arrangements of a most irregular nature. That correspondence, which had come into your possession some 6 months ago, would have rendered your position in this household untenable upon its disclosure. Mr. Thorne had informed you, I presume, that he intended to alter his will, particularly with regard to the bequest of Ravenswood and its considerable estates to his nephew, rather than to you." The accuracy of this supposition seemed to strike Mrs. Thorne with the force of a physical blow, and she sank slowly into the nearest chair with the air of a woman who has exhausted the capacity to maintain her own weight. Inspector Cadby, his expression now suggesting that he was experiencing a profoundly disorienting dream from which he could not achieve wakefulness, began to formulate a question, which Whimsy, with a gesture of gentle suppression, forestalled. "The button," Whimsy continued, addressing the room at large though his gaze remained fixed upon Mrs. Thorne's face, "was your own, was it not? Removed from your evening gown when you climbed through the window, caught upon the frame as you made your departure. You retained its twin as a sort of, shall we say, talisman of your accomplishment, a reminder of the moment when your marriage's financial security was assured by the simple expedient of converting a husband into a corpse." Mrs. Marchant, who had been maintaining a steadfast silence throughout these revelations, now produced a small velvet button from her own pocket and extended it toward Whimsy with a gesture that suggested she had anticipated, if not the precise details, then at least the general trajectory of his conclusions. The button, when Whimsy received it from Mrs. Marchant's extended hand, proved to be of identical composition and hue to the specimen he had discovered upon the study carpet. A matching pair separated by circumstance and the vicissitudes of a murder most deliberately orchestrated. The revelation that Mrs. Marchant had possessed this corroborating evidence throughout the proceedings suggested that the Honorable Gerald's wife had conducted her own investigation with a thoroughness that would have reflected considerable credit upon her, had it been directed toward purposes less personally invested in the affairs of her guests. Whimsy regarded her with an expression of mingled admiration and mild reproach, as one might regard a proc who has exceeded one's own instructions with such alacrity that the entire enterprise has been rendered somewhat more complicated than originally envisioned. "You discovered the button," he observed, phrasing it as a statement rather than an inquiry, sometime during the night or early morning, and recognizing its significance, retained it as evidence, whilst simultaneously comprehending that its discovery would necessarily implicate the wearer. Mrs. Marchant inclined her head in acknowledgment of this supposition, confirming that she had found the button whilst conducting her own examination of the study at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, some 2 hours prior to Parsons' discovery of the body, and that she had engaged in a period of considerable internal debate regarding the appropriate course of action before ultimately deciding that professional assistance would prove necessary. The precision of this revelation seemed to strike Inspector Cadby with something approaching the force of a hammer strike, and he rose from his chair with considerably less grace than he had employed in his initial descent into its embrace, his face now achieving a shade of crimson that suggested the presence of a considerable quantity of blood in the region of his cranial extremities. His attempts to articulate a response proved largely incomprehensible, consisting primarily of fragmentary utterances regarding procedure, evidence, and involvement. Phrases which Whimsy received with the sort of sympathetic tolerance one extends to a man attempting to operate machinery whose fundamental mechanisms he does not comprehend. Mrs. Thorne, observing the deterioration of the inspector's composure with an expression that suggested she found his distress a source of considerable personal satisfaction, leaned backward in her chair with the air of a woman who had ceased to maintain even the pretense of civility or cooperation. When Whimsy proceeded to articulate the complete sequence of events as they had presumably transpired on the evening in question, her lips curved into something that approximated a smile, though the expression possessed qualities that suggested it derived from sources considerably darker than simple amusement. The reconstruction of events, as Whimsy presented it, proceeded with the methodical inevitability of a mathematical proof, each element following naturally from those that preceded it, and building inexorably toward a conclusion that admitted of no alternative interpretation. Mrs. Thorne had, he suggested, discovered her husband's intention to disinherit her approximately 1 week prior to the commission of the murder, during an afternoon in which she had engaged in the entirely innocent act of retrieving a correspondence that had accidentally fallen behind the desk in his study. The contents of that correspondence, relating to certain financial arrangements involving Mr. Thorne's brother in India and the disposition of moneys that the family had believed lost in the collapse of a mercantile venture some 15 years previously, had suggested that her husband possessed considerably greater resources than he had hitherto permitted her to believe, and that he intended to utilize those resources for purposes that did not include the maintenance of his wife in the style to which she had become accustomed. Upon learning of his intention to alter his will, she had engaged in a period of frantic consideration of the various mechanisms by which one might prevent such an outcome, ultimately arriving at the conclusion that prevention was considerably less feasible than elimination. The plan, when it had finally crystallized in her consciousness, had possessed an elegant simplicity that suggested the hand of someone possessed of considerable intelligence, if not considerable moral restraint. She had obtained from a former paramour, a gentleman of theatrical background with whom she had maintained a correspondence of some intimacy during the years of her marriage. The precise specifications regarding the discharge of firearms and the appearance of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Armed with this knowledge, she had retired to her chamber at the ostensible hour of 10 o'clock, undressed with apparent normality, and then assumed the evening gown that she had concealed beneath her mattress for the preceding 3 days. The removal of the button had been entirely deliberate, accomplished prior to her departure from her chamber in order to leave a tangible mark upon the scene that she believed she could subsequently explain away as insignificant or coincidental. She had then proceeded through the corridors of Ravenswood with the careful footfalls of one accustomed to navigating darkened passages, made her way to the external wall adjacent to the study, and, utilizing the knowledge that the window mechanism possessed a particular idiosyncrasy of which only the long-term residents of the household could be aware, had effected entry with a minimum of disturbance or noise. The revolver, which she had removed from its customary location in her husband's desk during an afternoon visit to his study some months prior, had been retained in her possession, and she had used it with a steadiness of aim that suggested either considerable practice or a remarkable absence of emotional response to the prospect of committing murder. The subsequent arrangement of the body, the placement of the revolver in her husband's hand, and the destruction of the compromising correspondence had all been accomplished with a methodical precision that belied the impromptu nature of her discovery of her husband's intentions. The most significant element of her stratagem, Whimsy continued with the air of one expounding upon a particularly intricate mathematical principle, had involved the manipulation of temporal perception through the mechanism of the study's fire and heating apparatus. Upon her entrance through the window, Mrs. Thorne had immediately proceeded to extinguish the fire that Parsons had so carefully tended, replacing the remaining fuel with a quantity of damp wood that she had concealed in the garden prior to her departure from her chamber. This substitution of materials would, over the course of the subsequent hours, produce a fire that burned at a considerably lower temperature and with substantially less brightness than the original conflagration, thereby creating the false impression that the study had been unoccupied throughout the night and that no intervention had taken place within its confines. Furthermore, she had manipulated the window mechanism in such a fashion as to suggest that it remained sealed from within, whilst in fact leaving it sufficiently loose that a person departing the room would require merely the gentlest of pressure to achieve egress. The genius of this arrangement, Whimsy observed with something approaching admiration, had been that it created the impression of a completely sealed chamber, whilst simultaneously providing a means of departure that would leave no evidence of forced entry or intrusion. She had then retraced her steps through the corridors of the house, removed her evening gown and substituted her nightclothes, and returned to her bed to await the discovery of the body with a composure that suggested either extraordinary callousness or a degree of psychological detachment from the consequences of her actions. When Whimsy concluded this exposition, Mrs. Thorne rose from her chair with a sudden violence that caused Inspector Cadby to take an involuntary step backward, as though her physical movement might constitute a prelude to some form of assault. Her expression, which had until that moment retained a quality of cold appreciation for the accuracy of Whimsy's deductions, underwent a transformation into something considerably more visceral and immediate. "You understand nothing," she declared, her voice emerging with a harsh quality that suggested years of accumulated bitterness suddenly breaking through the carefully maintained facade of polite society. Charles was a fool and a hypocrite. He spent the first years of our marriage assuring me that his resources were limited, that we must live within a modest income, that I should reconcile myself to the absence of those luxuries to which I had been accustomed in my father's house. All the while, he possessed sufficient capital to maintain a mistress in London, to invest in speculative ventures, and to accumulate wealth that he intended to leave to a nephew he scarcely knew. I gave him 15 years of my life. 15 years of managing his household, of tolerating his infidelities, of pretending to respect a man who regarded me as nothing more than an ornament, to be displayed when convenient and forgotten when it suited his purposes. Her hands, which had clenched into fists at her sides, now opened and closed repeatedly, as though engaging in some form of physical struggle to maintain her remaining self-control. Whimsy received this outburst with the sort of patient tolerance that suggested he had anticipated precisely such an expression of accumulated grievance, and he permitted her to continue without interruption, recognizing that the cathartic process of confession often requires a period of emotional discharge before rational discourse becomes possible once more. When Mrs. Thorne had concluded her recitation and stood before him with her shoulders slumped and her elegant posture wholly abandoned, he approached her with a gentleness that seemed wholly incongruous with the nature of the circumstances. "The tragedy," he observed, his voice assuming a quality of genuine sadness that those present had not previously heard him employ, "is not that you murdered your husband, but rather that you believed murder to be your only recourse. There existed other mechanisms by which you might have addressed the inequities of your situation, solicitors, justices, avenues of redress that the law provides precisely for circumstances such as these. Your intelligence, which is considerable, has been directed toward the accomplishment of a crime when it might have been employed toward the effectuation of a divorce that would have left you in considerably less precarious circumstances than you now find yourself." Mrs. Thorne's response to this observation was to sink slowly into a chair and bury her face in her hands, her body undergoing a series of convulsive movements that suggested the presence of considerable emotional disturbance. Inspector Cadby, observing this deterioration and apparently concluding that the moment had arrived for the assertion of his professional authority, commenced the process of formally charging Mrs. Thorne with the murder of her husband. Reading from a notebook whose pages trembled slightly in his hands, and delivering his pronouncements in a voice that suggested considerable internal uncertainty regarding the appropriateness of his actions, Mrs. Marchant excused herself from the room with a murmured apology, whilst Bunter, with the sort of discreet efficiency that constituted his defining characteristic, withdrew to arrange for the summoning of additional constabulary personnel and the preparation of appropriate documentation. Whimsy remained standing in the center of the study, his gaze fixed upon the empty fireplace with its scattered ashes and charred remnants, his expression assuming the quality of a man contemplating not the successful conclusion of an investigation, but rather the profound disappointment inherent in the discovery that human nature, when subjected to sufficient pressure and provocation, seems remarkably capable of descending into violence as a mechanism of response to injustice. The evening that followed the formal arrest of Mrs. Thorne possessed a quality of suspended animation that seemed to permeate Ravenswood Manor like a particularly persistent fog, rendering all sounds muted and all movement sluggish, as though the house itself had entered into a state of shock at the violence that had been perpetrated within its walls. Inspector Cadby had, after considerable deliberation and the consultation of his superior officer via telephone, departed with his prisoner in a motor car that seemed to bear away not merely a woman, but rather the final vestiges of normalcy that had characterized the manor throughout the preceding decades. Mrs. Marchant had retreated to her private sitting room with the sort of determined focus that suggested she intended to apply herself to the restoration of domestic order through the medium of correspondence and the issuing of various household directives, whilst the servants of Ravenswood had commenced the process of consuming the evening meal in the kitchen with considerably less than their customary enthusiasm. Parsons, the valet whose minor deception regarding the sounds emanating from the study had so significantly contributed to the entire investigation, had been observed in the servants' hall engaging in an activity that bore a striking resemblance to the consumption of considerably more brandy than was advisable for a man in his professional position, his continued employment having been rendered distinctly uncertain by the revelations of the day. Whimsy, observing all of these developments with the detached interest of one who has accomplished the purpose for which he was summoned and now finds himself in the peculiar position of awaiting the moment at which departure becomes appropriate, had retreated to the library with a first edition of the 1623 folio and a bottle of the Honorable Gerald's most distinguished claret. It was during this period of post-investigational quietude that Bunter appeared at the library door with the sort of significant expression that indicated the presence of information requiring Whimsy's immediate attention. The constabulary, Bunter reported, had been conducting their preliminary examination of the materials recovered from the study fireplace, and the chemist engaged by Inspector Cadby to analyze the charred fragments had made a discovery of considerable consequence. The materials recovered from the ashes did not, in fact, constitute the whole of the compromising correspondence that Mrs. Thorne had allegedly destroyed, but rather represented merely a portion thereof. Several pages, apparently overlooked in the urgency of the destruction process, had survived the conflagration in a condition sufficiently intact to permit their examination and interpretation. These remaining documents revealed not merely the existence of the financial arrangements that had precipitated the murder, but rather the presence of a considerably more complex and elaborate scheme of inheritance and financial manipulation that implicated not solely the deceased Mr. Thorne, but also the presence of a third party, whose involvement suggested that the motivations underlying the commission of the crime might be considerably more intricate than the surface examination had initially suggested. The revelation of this additional complication seemed to strike Whimsy with the force of a particularly disagreeable observation, and he set aside both his claret and his first edition with a gesture that suggested the interruption of his evening had produced in him a sensation approaching irritation. One would have supposed, he observed to Bunter with a tone suggesting injured dignity, that the conclusion of a murder investigation might have been achieved without the necessity for the introduction of additional complications in the form of overlooked evidence and undiscovered implications. The perpetrator has been apprehended. The mechanism of the crime has been thoroughly explicated, and the motives underlying the commission of the act have been subjected to considerable analysis and exposition. What possible purpose could be served by the discovery of materials that merely serve to render the entire affair more labyrinthine and obscure? Bunter, however, persisted in the articulation of his findings with the sort of patient determination that suggested he possessed knowledge that Whimsy's philosophical objections did not ultimately constitute a valid argument against the necessity of his attendance to the matter. The documents in question, Bunter explained, appeared to contain references to a considerable sum of money, approximately £15,000, that had been conditionally bequeathed to a third party contingent upon the survival of the deceased for a period of at least 5 additional years, the fulfillment of which condition would have been rendered impossible by the circumstances of Mrs. Thorne's criminal intervention. This revelation prompted Whimsy to rise from his chair with considerably more alacrity than he had previously displayed, his expression assuming the quality of a man who has suddenly recognized that the architecture of the crime he has spent the entire day constructing may contain structural deficiencies of considerable magnitude. If, as the documents suggested, the murder of Charles Augustus Thorne would necessarily result in the forfeiture of a substantial bequest to this third party, then the motivational structure that had appeared so clearly established through the course of the investigation underwent a transformation of remarkable significance. The question that now presented itself, Whimsy observed with rising urgency, was not solely who had murdered Mr. Thorne, but rather whether the individual currently in the custody of the constabulary had acted as the primary architect of the crime, or merely as an unwitting instrument in a conspiracy of considerably greater complexity and considerably darker psychological underpinnings. The velvet button, which had seemed such a precise and deliberate marking of Mrs. Thorne's guilt, now began to assume the character of a potential piece of misdirection, a carefully placed false clue designed to direct suspicion toward precisely the individual who was now languishing in police custody. Whimsy's expression, as he communicated these concerns to Bunter whilst simultaneously moving toward the library door with the purposefulness of a man who has suddenly recognized the necessity for immediate action, assumed the quality of a gamesman who has discovered that he has been playing an entirely different game than he had previously supposed, and that his victory of the afternoon now possessed a quality of defeat considerably more comprehensive than he had initially comprehended. The examination of the partially recovered documents, which Whimsy conducted with a sort of meticulous attention that suggested he was now engaged in a considerably more challenging intellectual endeavor than the straightforward deduction that had occupied his morning, revealed a scheme of such labyrinthine complexity that it seemed almost miraculous that the perpetrators had managed to maintain the secrecy of their enterprise for any significant duration whatsoever. The bequest in question, which had initially appeared to be merely a peripheral detail in the financial arrangements involving Mr. Thorne's brother in India, was in fact the central mechanism through which an individual named Edward Ashford, identified in the documents only as E.A., the gentleman previously mentioned, stood to gain possession of a considerable portion of the Thorne estate should certain conditions be satisfied prior to the testator's death. The conditions themselves, as articulated in the fragmentary correspondence that had survived the fire, appeared to involve the maintenance of Mr. Thorne's life for a period extending some 5 years beyond the date upon which the will had been executed, a circumstance which would have necessitated Mr. Thorne's continued existence as a prerequisite for the realization of Mr. Ashford's financial aspirations. That Mrs. Thorne's actions had rendered this condition impossible to fulfill suggested either a remarkable degree of fortuitous coincidence or the presence of a more sophisticated conspiracy in which the widow had been manipulated into serving as the instrument of her own husband's destruction without fully comprehending the ultimate purposes to which her actions would be directed. The identification of Edward Ashford as the mysterious beneficiary necessitated the immediate expansion of Whimsy's investigation into territories considerably more extensive than the immediate confines of Ravenswood Manor, and he accordingly summoned Bunter and commenced the process of consulting certain directories and reference materials that he suspected might prove illuminating regarding the gentleman's history and connections. The name Ashford, it transpired, was not unfamiliar to the annals of the English countryside, being associated with a family of considerable standing whose primary seat lay some 30 miles to the north of Ravenswood, in a manor house which had been in their possession for a period extending back several centuries. Edward Ashford himself was identified in the current edition of Debrett's as a gentleman of the age of 42 years, unmarried and possessed of a reputation for scholarly pursuits that had apparently engaged his attention throughout the greater portion of his adult life. More intriguingly, however, a consultation of certain financial records that Whimsy succeeded in obtaining through the intermediary of a solicitor of his acquaintance revealed that Mr. Ashford had, in recent years, undergone a considerable alteration in his circumstances, having apparently exhausted the greater portion of his inherited capital through expenditures related to the maintenance of his scholarly interests and the pursuit of various archaeological excavations in the Mediterranean region. The timing of Mr. Thorne's bequest, dating to approximately 3 years prior to the present date, appeared to coincide precisely with the moment at which Mr. Ashford's financial difficulties would have achieved their most acute phase, suggesting that the conditional nature of the bequest might have been specifically designed to provide incentive for the preservation of Mr. Thorne's life during the critical period in which his financial embarrassment would have been most pressing. The revelation of these connections prompted Whimsy to undertake the journey to Mr. Ashford's estate, Blackthorn Manor, accompanied by Bunter and fortified by the sort of determination that suggested he was now engaged in the pursuit of a considerably more elusive quarry than the domestically aggrieved Mrs. Thorne. The manor itself, when they arrived in the late afternoon light that rendered the stone walls a particular shade of gray that seemed simultaneously austere and melancholic, presented the appearance of a gentleman's residence that had been subjected to considerable neglect and financial parsimony in its maintenance. The gardens, which might at some earlier period have been extensively cultivated, had lapsed into a state of semi-wildness, and the windows of several wings appeared to be shuttered and apparently uninhabited. Mr. Ashford himself, when they were finally admitted to his presence in what appeared to be a study of considerable antiquarian character, bore evidence of being a man whose circumstances had undergone a marked deterioration in recent times. He was thin to the point of appearing almost cadaverous, with the sort of intense, feverish gaze that suggested either intellectual preoccupation of a consuming nature or the effects of some form of chronic indisposition that had steadily undermined his physical constitution. When Whimsy introduced himself and articulated his purpose in calling, Mr. Ashford's response was characterized by an expression of such complete and utter lack of surprise that it seemed almost as though he had been anticipating this visit for some considerable duration and had merely been awaiting the moment of its inevitable arrival. "You have come regarding the death of Charles Thorne," Mr. Ashford observed, his voice possessing a quality of weary resignation that suggested the utterance of a statement that he had rehearsed many times in his own consciousness but had lacked the opportunity to articulate to anyone else. "I confess that I have been anticipating your arrival ever since I received the intelligence of his death through the agency of the morning newspapers. The involvement of Lord Peter Wimsey in the investigation of the matter rendered the probability of my eventual interrogation sufficiently high that I have spent the intervening period engaging in the composition of a full account of my relationship with the deceased and the circumstances that led to the conclusion of our association." He moved toward a desk upon which there rested a considerable quantity of written materials, and extracted therefrom a sheaf of pages that he extended toward Whimsy, with a gesture that suggested he was delivering not merely a document, but rather a confession of considerable psychological and moral significance. As Whimsy accepted these materials and commenced the process of examining their contents, Mr. Ashford settled into a chair with the air of a man who has finally achieved the relief of burdens that have weighed upon his consciousness for an extended duration. The document that Whimsy examined proved to be not merely a confession, but rather an elaborate psychological exposition of such extraordinary candor that it seemed almost inconceivable that a man of Mr. Ashford's apparent breeding and education would have committed to paper observations of such painfully self-aware introspection regarding his own moral failings and intellectual deterioration. The narrative commenced with an account of Mr. Ashford's friendship with Charles Augustus Thorne, a connection that had originated during the years of their mutual residence at Cambridge and had persisted through the subsequent decades despite the considerable divergence of their respective life trajectories. Whereas Mr. Ashford had devoted himself to the pursuit of classical scholarship and archaeological investigation, Mr. Thorne had undertaken the considerably more conventional course of establishing himself as a country gentleman of moderate means and respectable if unremarkable standing. The friendship had been maintained primarily through the mechanism of occasional correspondence and the exchange of visits that, by the time of the events presently under consideration, had become increasingly infrequent and characterized by a certain quality of mutual obligation rather than genuine affection or intellectual stimulation. It was during one such visit, approximately 3 years prior to the present date, that Mr. Thorne had revealed to Mr. Ashford the existence of certain financial difficulties that he had encountered in the course of his Indian investments, and had, with the sort of casual benevolence that marks the behavior of a man possessed of considerable unexamined privilege, offered to include Mr. Ashford in his will as the beneficiary of a substantial bequest conditional upon Mr. Thorne's survival for a period of no fewer than 5 years following the date of the will's execution. The significance of this gesture, as Mr. Ashford articulated it in his written account, had been that it constituted precisely the mechanism through which his own financial embarrassments might be alleviated without the necessity for any action on his part beyond the simple acceptance of his friend's generosity and the maintenance of the friendship for a period extending 5 years into the future. The arrangement had suited Mr. Ashford admirably, as it permitted him to embark upon a series of archaeological excavations in Greece and Egypt that he had long desired to undertake, financed by the sort of financial expectations that, whilst not immediately available, nonetheless seemed sufficiently certain to justify the expenditure of borrowed capital against the eventual realization of the bequest. However, as Mr. Ashford's account proceeded to elaborate, the circumstances surrounding Mr. Thorne's marriage to his second wife, the present Mrs. Thorne, had introduced a complication of considerable magnitude into the arrangement. It became apparent to Mr. Ashford, through the agency of various communications from Mr. Thorne and subsequent observations during visits to Ravenswood, that Mrs. Thorne exercised a degree of influence over her husband that approached something resembling absolute control, and that her disposition toward Mr. Ashford was characterized by a hostility that seemed disproportionate to any actual interaction between them. The explanation for this hostility, Mr. Ashford had come to suspect, derived from Mrs. Thorne's awareness that the conditional bequest represented a claim upon the Thorne estate that would necessarily diminish the portion available for her own disposal should Mr. Thorne predecease her without the condition being satisfied. It was approximately 6 months prior to the present date that Mr. Ashford had received a communication of extraordinary significance from an individual whom he had never previously encountered, but who identified himself as possessing extensive knowledge of Mr. Ashford's financial circumstances and his intimate relationship with Mr. Thorne. This individual, whose identity Mr. Ashford, in his written account, carefully concealed through the medium of cryptic reference, had proposed to Mr. Ashford a scheme of such audacious simplicity that it had seemed almost miraculous that it had not been conceived by Mr. Ashford himself, possessed as he was of considerable intellectual capacity. The proposition was merely that Mrs. Thorne should be furnished with a certain quantity of information regarding the conditional bequest and the financial motivation that underlay its existence, coupled with carefully constructed documentation suggesting that Mr. Ashford possessed intentions regarding the acceleration of his inheritance that would necessitate Mr. Thorne's death prior to the satisfaction of the conditional period. This information, if properly presented to Mrs. Thorne, would quite naturally dispose her toward the commission of the very crime that would necessarily result in the forfeiture of Mr. Ashford's bequest, a circumstance which would conveniently eliminate a financial obligation that Mr. Ashford had come to regard with increasing desperation as he recognized the inadequacy of his borrowed capital to sustain his continued archaeological pursuits. The arrangement, as Mr. Ashford articulated it in his written confession, amounted to nothing less than the deliberate manipulation of a woman into committing murder for purposes of profit that would accrue not to herself, but to the man who had orchestrated her downfall. When Wimsey had completed his examination of the document and raised his gaze to meet that of Mr. Ashford, his expression assumed the quality of a man who has traversed the distance from the contemplation of a reasonably comprehensible crime of passion to the recognition of a conspiracy of such calculated malevolence that it seemed almost beyond the capacity of ordinary human consciousness to have conceived it. The question that presents itself, Wimsey observed with a quietness that belied the magnitude of his revelation, is not whether you orchestrated this affair. Your own confession renders that matter abundantly clear, but rather the identity of the individual who initially approached you with the proposition. The arrangement required knowledge not merely of your financial circumstances and your connection to Mr. Thorne, but also of Mrs. Thorne's psychology, her vulnerabilities, and the precise mechanism through which she might be motivated toward the commission of this particular crime. Such intimate knowledge could have been acquired only by someone in possession of sustained and detailed observation of the household at Ravenswood, someone whose position within the manor afforded them access to the private communications and confidences of all parties involved. Mr. Ashford's face, upon hearing these words, underwent a transformation that suggested the arrival of a moment that he had simultaneously anticipated and dreaded with considerable intensity. The confession that emerged from Mr. Ashford's lips in the hours that followed constituted not merely an admission of his own culpability, but rather the unveiling of a conspiracy of such Byzantine intricacy that it seemed almost to defy rational comprehension that it could have been conceived and executed by individuals of ordinary intelligence and resolution. The individual who had approached him with the original proposition, Mr. Ashford reluctantly acknowledged, was none other than Parsons. The valet, whose apparent simplicity and servile demeanor had successfully concealed a degree of intellectual sophistication and psychological manipulation that rendered him considerably more formidable an adversary than his ostensible position within the Ravenswood household would have suggested. Parsons had, it transpired, been engaged in a prolonged and carefully orchestrated campaign of observation and psychological analysis directed toward every member of the Thorne household for a period extending back nearly 2 years prior to the commission of the murder, a campaign whose ultimate purpose had been the identification of the precise mechanism through which Mr. Thorne might be eliminated in such a fashion as to result in the maximum disorder and confusion regarding the identity of the perpetrator. The relationship between Parsons and Mr. Ashford, as Mr. Ashford's confession elaborated, had commenced through the agency of a chance encounter at a London club, where Parsons had been attending in the capacity of an accompanying servant to a gentleman of Mr. Ashford's acquaintance. Through the mechanism of carefully contrived and apparently accidental conversations, Parsons had gradually insinuated himself into Mr. Ashford's confidence, eventually revealing his knowledge of the conditional bequest and his own design to profit from its forfeiture through the medium of Mrs. Thorne's criminal action. The motivation underlying Parsons' elaborate scheme, as Mr. Ashford had eventually come to understand, derived from a circumstance of considerable personal significance that had remained concealed from the general knowledge of the Ravenswood household throughout the duration of his employment. Parsons had, some 15 years prior to the present events, been involved in a romantic entanglement with a woman of humble station whose family had been financially ruined through the agency of an investment scheme in which Charles Augustus Thorne had played a significant but deliberately obscured role. The woman in question had, as a consequence of her family's financial catastrophe, been compelled to enter into a marriage of considerable unhappiness with a man of brutal temperament and limited intelligence, whilst Parsons had been forced to witness her deterioration from a position that afforded him no capacity for intervention or assistance. When the woman had died under circumstances that Parsons had always suspected involved her husband's brutality, though no official investigation had been conducted, Parsons had commenced a period of extended contemplation regarding the mechanisms through which he might effectuate revenge upon the man whom he held responsible for the entire concatenation of misfortunes. The revelation of Mr. Thorne's financial vulnerability and his conditional bequest to Mr. Ashford had appeared to Parsons as the mechanism through which such revenge might be accomplished, not through the direct infliction of violence upon Mr. Thorne himself, but rather through the manipulation of circumstances that would result in his death at the hands of an individual whose own motivations would provide sufficient justification for her criminal action in the eyes of a society that comprehends crimes of passion far more readily than it comprehends crimes of calculated malevolence. The precision with which Parsons had orchestrated the entire affair became apparent as Mr. Ashford proceeded to articulate the specific mechanisms through which he had been manipulated into cooperation with the scheme. Parsons had possessed detailed knowledge of Mr. Ashford's financial circumstances, acquired through the medium of careful observation and the cultivation of connections within Mr. Ashford's circle of acquaintances. He had been cognizant of Mr. Ashford's receipt of communications from Mr. Thorne regarding the modification of certain financial arrangements, and the intention to alter his will in a fashion that would result in diminished provision for the bequest. Most significantly, Parsons had provided Mr. Ashford with the precise documentation regarding Mrs. Thorne's discovery of the conditional bequest and her growing awareness of the threat it posed to her own financial security. Documentation that Parsons himself had carefully fabricated and planted within the study at Ravenswood for Mrs. Thorne to discover. The velvet button, which had seemed throughout the investigation to constitute such a decisive piece of evidence against Mrs. Thorne, had in fact been deliberately introduced into the crime scene by Parsons himself, obtained from the hem of one of Mrs. Thorne's evening gowns, and carefully positioned to ensure that suspicion would immediately and irrevocably fall upon the widow. Parsons had anticipated with remarkable accuracy the manner in which the murder would be investigated, the conclusions that would be drawn regarding Mrs. Thorne's guilt, and the precise moment at which Whimsy would be summoned to Ravenswood to unravel a mystery that appeared superficially straightforward, but which concealed beneath its surface a conspiracy of considerably greater complexity. When Whimsy articulated these revelations to Mr. Ashford with the sort of quiet precision that suggested he had long since comprehended the true nature of the conspiracy and had been merely awaiting the confirmation of his suspicions, the gentleman's response was characterized by a collapse into a state of profound emotional and psychological devastation. He had, as he articulated through tears of what appeared to be genuine contrition, believed himself to be acting in concert with an individual who shared his own motivations of financial desperation and a desire for revenge against a man who had proven himself to be fundamentally contemptible in his treatment of others. The realization that he had been merely another instrument in Parsons' elaborate machinery of vengeance, that he had been manipulated into cooperation with a scheme whose ultimate consequences extended far beyond the simple elimination of a disliked individual, seemed to constitute a burden of such magnitude that it rendered him apparently incapable of maintaining his previous composure. Whimsy regarded him with an expression that suggested neither sympathy nor condemnation, but rather the detached observation of one contemplating the operation of psychological forces that render human beings capable of extraordinary moral degradation when subjected to sufficient pressure and manipulation. The apprehension of Parsons, which Whimsy initiated upon his return to Ravenswood Manor with Mr. Ashford's confession securely in his possession, proved to be a considerably more complicated undertaking than one might have initially supposed, for the valet had apparently anticipated the probability of his eventual exposure with sufficient accuracy to have made arrangements for his departure from the manor some hours prior to Whimsy's arrival. Inspector Cadby, upon being informed of the necessity to alter the focus of the investigation and to redirect his efforts toward the pursuit of an individual whose apparent guilt had been successfully concealed beneath layers of meticulous planning and psychological manipulation, underwent a transformation in demeanor that suggested he was experiencing something approaching a complete inversion of his previous understanding regarding the nature of the crime and the identity of its perpetrator. The constabulary undertook an immediate search of Parsons' chamber within the servants' quarters, discovering therein a quantity of materials that confirmed the valet's extraordinary degree of premeditation and psychological sophistication, detailed notes regarding the psychological vulnerabilities of every member of the Thorne household, sketches and diagrams of the study indicating the precise mechanisms through which the murder might be accomplished whilst appearing to constitute a suicide, and correspondence with various individuals indicating a network of connections that extended considerably beyond the confined circumstances of a country manor house. The discovery of these materials rendered abundantly clear that Parsons had engaged in a period of preparation extending back considerably further than the mere 6 months during which he had been in direct contact with Mr. Ashford, and that his scheme had been subjected to a degree of intellectual refinement that suggested the workings of a mind possessed of considerable analytical capacity and psychological insight. The pursuit of Parsons ultimately led the constabulary to the coastal town of Dover, where he had apparently intended to effect his departure from England through the mechanism of a vessel bound for the continent. However, the intervention of Whimsy, who had anticipated with remarkable prescience the direction of the valet's flight, and had communicated his suspicions to the appropriate authorities prior to commencing his investigation of Mr. Ashford, resulted in Parsons' apprehension at the very moment he was about to embark upon his journey to the continent. The confrontation between Whimsy and Parsons, which occurred in a customs house office overlooking the grey waters of the English Channel, constituted a moment of such extraordinary psychological intensity that even Inspector Cadby, who had been reluctant participant in the entire proceeding, seemed to comprehend that he was witnessing an encounter that transcended the ordinary mechanisms of criminal investigation and entered into the realm of philosophical discourse regarding the nature of justice, revenge, and the moral implications of calculated malevolence. When Whimsy articulated to Parsons the complete chain of deduction that had led to the identification of his culpability, The valet's response was characterized not by denial or protestation of innocence, but rather by an almost philosophical acknowledgement of the manner in which his scheme had been executed and the precise points at which it had been vulnerable to discovery by a sufficiently astute investigator. "You comprehend, I presume," Parsons observed with a quietness that suggested he had resigned himself entirely to the consequences of his actions, "that the guilt for Mr. Thorne's death rests not solely upon my shoulders but equally upon those of Mrs. Thorne and Mr. Ashford, both of whom possessed the capacity to refuse participation in the scheme and yet chose instead to permit their own desires and grievances to override any considerations of moral restraint or ethical principle. I did not force Mrs. Thorne to commit murder. I merely provided her with the information and motivation that rendered such an action comprehensible to her consciousness and justified by the circumstances of her own life. Similarly, Mr. Ashford was not compelled into cooperation with my design. He entered willingly into an arrangement that he recognized as morally dubious because his financial desperation rendered such moral compromise acceptable in his own estimation. The observation, whilst technically accurate, seemed to strike Wimsey with the force of a revelation that he had perhaps not fully anticipated, and his expression underwent a subtle alteration that suggested a moment of genuine internal conflict regarding the moral distinctions between passive and active participation in the commission of a crime. Inspector Cadby, observing this momentary wavering in Wimsey's composure, seemed to recognize that the investigation had achieved a conclusion that admitted of considerably more complexity than the simple identification and apprehension of a perpetrator. The trial that ensued in the months following these events resulted in the conviction of Parsons for the murder of Charles Augustus Thorne, though the precise nature of his culpability and the degree to which his actions constituted direct participation in the crime as opposed to carefully orchestrated manipulation of others into committing the crime became the subject of considerable legal and philosophical debate. Mrs. Thorne was subsequently exonerated of the charge of murder when the evidence regarding Parsons' manipulation of circumstances became apparent to the court, though her own role in the commission of the crime rendered her situation sufficiently morally ambiguous that society's judgment of her actions remained divided and uncertain. Mr. Ashford was obliged to undertake a period of imprisonment for his participation in the conspiracy, a consequence that he accepted with the sort of resignation that suggested he had long since recognized the inevitable nature of such punishment. The conditional bequest, having been rendered null and void by the circumstances of Mr. Thorne's death, was distributed among various charitable institutions at the direction of Mr. Thorne's brother in India, who had apparently possessed sufficient moral clarity to recognize that no portion of his brother's estate ought to accrue to individuals tainted by association with the circumstances of his death. Wimsey's return to London, which occurred approximately 3 weeks following the apprehension of Parsons, was marked by a certain quality of philosophical contemplation that those who knew him recognized as indicative of a man whose confidence in the rational ordering of human affairs had been subjected to considerable strain by his recent experiences. When Bunter inquired regarding his satisfaction with the conclusion of the investigation, Wimsey's response was characterized by a quotation from Sophocles rendered into English. "The terrible thing is that we are all guilty, all complicit in the machinery of human suffering, and the commission of justice merely substitutes one form of guilt for another." He subsequently devoted himself to the composition of a monograph on the historical variants of the classical orders of architecture, a pursuit that suggested he had determined that the investigation of human criminal behavior was considerably less amenable to the application of logical principles than the study of inanimate structures, and that the solution to the riddle of human malevolence remained fundamentally beyond the capacity of even the most extraordinary intellect to fully comprehend or explain.